Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy, and welcome to One to One. During the last presidential debate, Donald Trump famously said of Hillary Clinton, "Such a nasty woman." And these words quickly entered the public consciousness. While some were outraged, some women took to wearing those words as a badge of honor. In her new book, Nasty Women, Feminism, Resistance, and Revolution in Trump's America, editor and journalist Samhita Mukhopadhyay and co-editor Kate Harding have gathered some of today's foremost feminist writers in an effort to make sense of the current political climate and why Donald Trump won the election and Hillary Clinton lost it. Welcome. You write that this was originally meant to be a book of essays by women writers responding to Hillary Clinton's victory.
Yeah, so the anthology starts with the night of the election, and I had written a 2,000-word essay that I had filed to my editor about the historic first win of the first ever woman president. Sent it to my editor, ran off to the Javits Center, ready to witness history. We all know that's not how the night went. And when I got back and realized we weren't going to publish the essay, I realized that there were probably writers all over the country that had essays that they were never going to publish about what this election meant to them. And I immediately emailed my co-editor and said, you know, she had kind of posted something similarly, and I said, why don't we get these essays together and see what these women have to say? Mm-hmm. Reading the essay again, kind of, reflecting on what we lost instead of what we thought we were going to win that night.
And one of the themes that runs through many of the essays is exactly that, the shock, the disbelief, and numbness that these women, all of them feminists, all these are feminist writers, felt when it became clear that Hillary Clinton had lost. Another theme that comes through the book is that despite all of the post-campaign hand-wringing about how Hillary Clinton had been such a terrible candidate and had run such a screwed-up campaign, that the main reason she lost was blatant sexism. You wrote that it was the story of a smart girl who's done her homework but loses to the class clown who barely shows up for work. Was it sexism that took Hillary Clinton down?
I think it was a variety of issues. I don't think that her gender helped her. I would say that much. I do think that a lot of the criticism against her was unprecedented, and the aggressiveness of it did rely on her gender. But I think it was a combination of factors. I think that it was, also race and Trump's kind of ability to campaign on a type of racism that really was seductive to a lot of voters. So I think it was a combination of that. But there is this kind of attitude, and I've really seen it on book tour as well, the types of questions that sometimes men at our events will ask, which is, it's not my fault I couldn't vote for her, I just didn't like her. Mm-hmm. And I don't understand that sentiment. Like, I don't understand the root of it outside of it being about sexism. Yeah. Because how could you dislike her so much that you would be okay if you're so against what Donald Trump stands for? How could you dislike her that much without the factor of gender being part of that?
Several writers, Kate Harding, your co-editor, and Cheryl Strayed among them, say the election made them realize that this country actually hates women while pretending that it doesn't. Do you think that's true?
I do. I do. I think that it's, that it's complicated to say that because, on an average day, I don't feel like people are coming up to me being like, I hate you, But I do think when you look at, first of all, not just Hillary, right? For any woman who's trying to navigate politics, the backlash that she often experiences, the hurdles, the fundraising obstacles, it's much harder for women to make it in politics. It's much harder for women to make it in the business world, in Hollywood. And now, as we're seeing, men have abused their power time and time again in several of these industries and have exploited women and their ambitions. So it's not that, what's rooted in that hatred is not believing that women are equal and that they exist for anything other than for male pleasure or for their, to serve them. Yeah, exactly.
Karina Giaccano talks about watching men that she liked, and I guess this would have been during the campaign. She talks about watching men that she liked, admired, and trusted reveal themselves as secret misogynists.
Yes.
Whenever she wrote anything good about Hillary Clinton, there was a backlash. And I have noticed, I confess that I watched reality shows. But on the shows where men and women are competing to be named, whether it's Top Chef or the best clothing designer or the best comedian or the last survivor on the island, that the male contestants tend to be very supportive of the women contestants until it comes down to, say, 2 men and 2 women or 2 men against 1 woman. And suddenly the men bond with each other and start trashing the female contestant. Someone in the book wrote that men like women until they threaten to become powerful.
Yes.
So it sounds like.
Yes, no, I do think that, and a lot of the conversation that's happened on the left since about, how much Hillary's been criticized for having not run a good enough campaign, despite the fact that we now know there was Russian interference in the election, right? That she's continually berated for losing without any analysis of the role that men so openly criticizing her, some of whom have now come out with allegations, sexual assault allegations against them as well, that kind of criticized her throughout the campaign. The role they played in perpetuating these kind of myths that really do surround women around competitiveness, and that, we're always great in support roles. It's the moment that we might threaten.
Launch out on our own, yeah. Chicana says there's no more despised figure on earth than a woman who seeks power. Yeah. And it seems like she's despised by women as well as by men.
Yes.
And I wonder what that psychology is about.
I do think, so when you think about who voted for Hillary, 53% of white women actually voted for Hillary, right? And that was a shock to the campaign.
No, actually voted for Trump.
Voted for Trump.
Right.
Did not vote for Hillary. Voted for Trump. And when you think about, how Hillary did run on, I'm with her, the historic first woman. I mean, that was a really big piece of why it was such a historical campaign. And I think that a lot of those women did not relate to the feminism of Hillary Clinton, right? They were even offended by it and took it as a referendum on their own definition of themselves and what it means for them to be a woman, which is either the choice to live at home or, also I think that they were also seduced by some of the racial rhetoric as well that trumped, for lack of a better word, some of their underlying fears and, of Hillary and kind of their hatred for Hillary. So, I would say it's internalized sexism, ultimately, at the end of the day, that, when it is threatening and it is unfamiliar, you question it, right? You question the emancipation of other women, and you think, oh, they must have done something to do that, because it threatens who you are.
Yeah. A number of women in the book write about their reaction to the Women's March in Washington the day after Trump's inauguration. And their reactions are really pretty mixed. Mm-hmm. Collier Meyerson, who is an African-American woman, talks about watching the march on television while having drinks with her black women friends and noticing that the march looked like a celebration, not an angry reflection of Donald Trump's misogyny or of women's inequality that this Hillary's loss seemed to confirm. That they didn't seem angry enough, that it was nothing like the outrage she felt at some of the Black Lives Matters events. And she said it seemed the white women were simply mobilized by the fear that something had gone awry in their white world of privilege. How did you feel? What were
my thoughts on that? So, yeah, I mean, Collier's essay was one of the more controversial essays in the book. I do think that, for the most part, many feminists were excited about the Women's March, and, that it's unprecedented that the election of Donald Trump led to one of the largest public mass gatherings of individuals that we've ever seen in American history. So that is exciting, and I think that's something to be, that was a moment where we stepped back and we said, no, we're not putting up with this. I think Collier's point is right in that, there was this politics of respectability that came with the march in terms of, there was pictures of women hugging the police, right? And that's not happening at BLM protests. And nor are the police treating BLM protesters the same way with the same type of quote unquote kid gloves that they might have, treated the women's march. So I do think that there's a double standard, and some of the most provocative signs at the march were, I hope I see you at the next Black Lives Matter protest, right? And that it took people really feeling it personally to actually step out, even though we've been grappling with injustices for the last 20, 30 years around police brutality and reproductive justice and access to healthcare, and poor women and women of color have kind of been fighting all of these things, and white women had this moment where they were like, oh, my country doesn't love me either. My country does, but that said, I think to contrast that, Alicia Garza's essay, who's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, towards the end of the book, really, she talks about how she went to the march and was critical of it and then walked out and said, actually, as an organizer, if someone comes to the table and you just start yelling at them, where were you when I asked you for this? They're not going to come back to the table.
Right.
And to build an actual movement, you need entryways for people.
Well, from the inception of the women's movement, there was always some suspicion, mistrust of it by Black women that doesn't seem to have completely gone away. It's as if we don't quite trust white women to do the right thing, at least all the time. And I guess some of that still lingers. We're going to take a short break, then we'll be back with Samhita Mukhopadhyay after this message. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy, and I'm talking with Samhita Mukhopadhyay, co-editor of Nasty Women, Feminism, Resistance, and Revolution in Trump's America. One of the most hard-hitting essays is by Sadie Doyle, who talks about how Trump's behavior is frequently described as crazy. I mean, who of us hasn't said, the man is nuts, he's insane, what crazy thing did he do today? And some people have speculated that he actually suffers from a specific disorder, like narcissistic personality disorder. But Doyle argues that Trump is not mentally ill. He's simply a very bad man, a schmuck, evil, violent, racist, and a woman hater. And the proof that he's not crazy is that all the terrible things he's done and said have worked for him. After all, he won the election. And she goes on to say that the reason he won is that his values are more widely shared than we like to admit, which is kind of scary if that's true. Do you agree with her?
I do. I think that calling Donald Trump crazy is letting him off the hook for a behavior that he has been rewarded for a repeated set of behavior. I mean, he lunged himself into the national spotlight about a lie about former President Barack Obama not being an American citizen, right? And this birtherism that he kind of launched his career with, and people held on to that. They held on to his coattails, and he started to galvanize a base from that early on, right? And so I do think that he, has a message that resonates deeply with some, deeply held views that have now shown themselves again. And I also think that, even if you look at what happened with Roy Moore this last week, after he threw his support against Roy Moore, despite, multiple allegations that he had had sexual relations with underage women, the GOP came forward and endorsed Roy Moore again in Alabama, right? So if he was as crazy as we think he is, I think that more of them should be taking a stand, and they do here and there, but ultimately they end up falling in line with him.
It is hammered home over and over again in these essays that 50% of white women voted for Donald Trump. And why they did, and we look at all of this misogynistic aspect of, his campaign and the people he's supporting. So why they voted for him, a majority of them, is the one question that is never quite answered to my satisfaction in this book. It's like, who are these white women
Yeah.
who voted for him and why?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, a certain percentage of Republican women always vote for Republicans.
Republican.
And so a percentage of that does account for that. And actually, less white women voted for Donald Trump than voted for Mitt Romney. So, some did either vote third party or, voted for Hillary. So I don't think it's statistically that far outside of normal voting patterns for white women, especially white Republican women. I think what's shocking about it is that there was this assumption that Hillary Clinton's message would resonate far more deeply than we anticipated. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why there's such a shock. I mean, when you think about it, 63% of white men voted for Donald Trump. What are those 60? We very rarely talk about that statistic. Why were they not also turned off by his race baiting and by his criticisms, his unfair criticisms of Barack Obama? So, I do think the reason that number, so many people have focused on that, is it's shocking that why would women vote against their own self-interest? But people vote against their own self-interest all the time. And, it may be in less obvious ways, but it's, I think it fits in with voting patterns.
In the same vein, I got a kick out of Zerlina Maxwell's essay, Trust Black Women. She says, Black women tried to save you, America. She didn't want to be saved. Because 94% of black women voted for Hillary Clinton. And one thing I didn't know was about all of the black women who took part in Hillary Clinton's campaign. Why do you think black women knew that Donald Trump would be a disaster for the country, while 53% of white women and 63% of white men didn't?
Well, I think black women first of all, haven't benefited from the structures that white women have benefited from in the same way, right, in just all throughout American history. And so have a much clearer sense of what's at stake from a democratic system that does not serve their needs. They're also extremely reliable voters. They always turn out, and they are pretty reliably Democratic voters. And so I think that compounded with Hillary did a lot of effective outreach with black women. I mean, she did an entire speaking tour practically with the mothers of the movement, which were mothers of boys that had been slain through police brutality. And, also engaged a lot of black women at all layers of her campaign, from the top to who was directly advising her, to the digital team, to the organizing teams. And so, I think that she just understood how to organize in the black community in a way that Trump wasn't even trying to, of course.
Yeah.
So, I think that accounts for it. But also, I think black women and women of color in general had more to lose under a Trump presidency, and that clear and present danger was just much clearer.
Katha Pollitt writes about how even though 69% of Americans say they support Roe v. Wade, and 75% of Americans believe that Planned Parenthood should get federal funds. Do we know why Republicans are so opposed to freedom of choice and why abortion is such a big issue with them?
I wish I understood a little bit more. I do think as a political playing point, I mean, people vote on choice. That is a motivator for especially the religious right, and I think for religious voters. And that is the other reason I think a percentage of the 53% of white women that voted for Trump were also for religious reasons. They're pro-life. And that's what motivates them to get to the polls. So, I think it's been a political organizing tactic. I think it's outdated, and I don't think it's relevant to the life that women live today. But I also think that, some of these right-wing Republicans who are anti-choice have a very limited view of what women's role in society should be. Because restricting choice means that you can't live your full life with equality, right? You don't have access to birth control. You don't have access, because it's not just abortion, right? Abortion is a very small percentage of this conversation. It's, reproductive health care. It's birth control. It's other types of contraception. And the idea that you should just be home and pregnant, and if you get pregnant, you should just have to deal with it. That is a very retrograde notion of what women's role in society should be. And I think that they continually go back to that. And that's where a lot of anti-choice legislation is rooted.
Yeah. So who were some of the writers who spoke directly to you?
To me, the essays I loved the most. So I think Nicole Chung's essay at the end really struck me. She is a transracial adoptee who is Korean American but was adopted by a white family in Washington State, and her family is Trump supporting. And that, I just think the nuance and the power of that essay really brought home for me that we are in a divided time. And these divisions are so much deeper than who we vote for. They are fundamentally how we see each other and how we see this country. And it's really through our intimate relationships and our interpersonal relationships that we can start to come closer together, I think, and I'm less interested in focusing on the candidate that's going to save us rather than actually focusing on values that are American, that, we believe in accepting immigrants. We believe, we don't want to put bans on people's families before the holidays, right? Just some basic general understanding. And that really brought home for me how that communication has broken down, or maybe it never existed in the first place. That really spoke to me. Jill Filipovich's essay, I think, is really strong because she talks about in the first 100 days, with a swipe of a pen, Trump chipped away at long, hard-fought wins, progressive wins, one of them being the global gag rule being reinstated. And that is that all international funding that goes to organizations that in any way provide abortion services is
speak about it.
Restricted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's millions of women across the world whose lives were impacted just by the swipe of a pen. So that was also really powerful.
Another recurring theme in the book was intersectionality. What does that mean?
Yeah.
For feminists, what does it mean?
So intersectionality, it's very much a buzzword these days. And I had the privilege almost a year ago of talking to Kimberly Crenshaw about who actually coined the term. She's an academic law professor and feminist writer, and she was actually on Anita Hill's legal team. And the concept of intersectionality really came about when she realized that Black women, specifically Anita Hill, were both experiencing race discrimination and sexism in the workplace, and there wasn't any type of legal precedent for how to litigate people that were at the intersection of these identities. And so intersectionality is really recognizing how power functions based on who you are. So who you are defines what you have access to in society and what types of legal rights you have and what kind of legal categories you might be put in, and that impacts your experience. And so that's really, and I think for feminism, intersectionality is really just always recognizing that there are always women that are struggling more than we are. There are always women that are more disenfranchised for reasons that we are not even thinking about.
And not just women, Native Americans, Blacks in general, Muslims, immigrants, transgenders. And that I think one of the calls in the book was that they have to support each other's demand for their rights. Well, it's a very interesting collection of essays and very thought-provoking. I like the fact that it just puts some of the hard facts, realities right out there. We're out of time. I want to thank Samhita Mukhopadhyay for joining me today. Her book, Nasty Women, Feminism, Resistance, and Revolution in Trump's America, published by Picador, part of Macmillan Publishing Group, is available online and in stores now. For One to One, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.